North, North Manchester 106.6.
You're listening to Hannah's Bookshelf.
It's Saturday, the 14th of March, just gone 6 minutes past 2, and you are listening to Hannah's Bookshelf here on North Manchester FM through till 4 p.m. today. And I'm delighted to welcome today's guest, because today's guest is someone who's been a regular contributor to Hannah's Bookshelf for ages now, but we've never actually had a conversation. Not a proper one. We've talked, we've heard him on the show every month talking about books, but me and him haven't been able to sit down and have a proper chat about his work. I'm really pleased to be welcoming to Hannah's Bookshelf, Kevin McGeary. Hi, Kevin.
Hi, Hannah. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for actually sitting, because it always feels like I just make you tell me about books that you've read instead of like us being able to have a proper chat. So I'm going to just give Kevin a quick introduction. He's a musician, a storyteller, an essay writer, and a reviewer. And you've heard his reviews on What Are You Reading for a while now. It's over a year, isn't it, that you've been contributing?
Yeah, it's over 2 years now.
Is it over 2 years? Oh, time flies. He also performs as the Kev, as a musical comedian. I think that's the right title, isn't it? Musical comedian.
Yeah, that's where my creative journey's taken me.
It is, and it's where our conversation's going to start, really, because the big news this year, as you mentioned briefly last week, actually, on What Are You Reading, is that you are soon to be a fringe performer. Kevin's going to be taking a show called Are Musical Comedians a Chinese PSYOP? To both the Edinburgh Fringe and, perhaps more importantly for us here at North Manchester FM, the Greater Manchester Fringe as well. Kevin, can we start there? Can we start with the show, the Fringe show that you're preparing, and also the Kev as well, your musical comedy act, the Kev, or persona?
Yes. Well, the persona isn't that different to the real me, just a bit swearier and more controversial. So it all started. So, I'll start from the beginning, shall I?
Yeah, please.
So at school, I was not a very good student, but I was a voracious reader, and I'd always wanted to be a published author. And one of the few things I showed a talent for was creative writing. And I was also a very dedicated guitarist when I was a teenager. But of course, no competent careers advisor would tell you to gamble your future on making music or writing creatively. So I went in all kinds of strange directions. So in 2006, when I was 22, I finished an MA in creative writing. And there weren't that many options when it came to us. I realized early on that my two major ambitions in life, one was to be a creative and the other was to function in society. These two ambitions were in direct conflict with each other. So I had to find a compromise. And I've done things over the course of my 20s and 30s. Some were good for both ambitions. Some were bad for both ambitions, but most things helped one ambition or the other. So in my 20s, teaching myself Mandarin was definitely good for both ambitions. But I thought, so my thesis for this master's degree was a novelette called Beyond the Wings. And so I did submit it to publishers and collected enough rejection letters to decorate a stately home, as every aspiring author has to. But then I realized when it comes to actually commercially published fiction, not only was it not in the same league as what appears on the shelves, it wasn't even the same sport. So I abandoned prose fiction for the foreseeable future in my 20s. And so by my mid-20s, I was living in a remote landlocked town in the middle of China, so in Hunan province. So Hunan is probably the equivalent of Arkansas or Oklahoma, so a flyover province. And I was one of the very few foreigners in this town. And just one of the very few forms of entertainment was karaoke. So most evenings I would go out, and I probably learned 2 new Mando pop songs a week on average. And as a study method that got out of hand, I started writing my own lyrics in Chinese and taking tunes I'd written as a teenager and putting them to Chinese lyrics. And when that hit a wall, when I realized that a Caucasian singing in Mandarin would never be taken seriously, and you would always just be seen as a sort of singing monkey. So eventually, to turn this weakness into a strength, I discovered musical comedy, and I realized. So as an undergraduate, our creative writing tutor, Archie Markham, said that good writing is characterized by 3 things: linguistic vitality, formal innovation, and emotional truth. And those 3 things, they're all quite abstract, and they're not things you can really quantify until after you've already finished something. But I found it was, with musical comedy, it was the first time I could apply all the knowledge I'd acquired over the years of creative writing, of music, of language, of poetry, philosophy, etc., but also genuinely connect to people. Because I would perform songs in grotty bars, and people would really dig them. So, and it's a case of Brendan O'Carroll from Mrs. Brown's Boys said, success is like disco music. Don't analyze it, just dance to it. So I leaned into it, and so over the years I've written so many comedy songs that when it comes to performing at Edinburgh, the only dilemma will be what material to leave out. And so as well as songs themselves, the biggest feature of my gigs is the between-song chit-chat, which the casual observer might think is just is off the cuff, but I actually script it to the last detail, but usually the best moments come off the cuff, if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah. And so the kind of writing of the comic songs, the kind of beginning of musical comedy, started when you were still in China.
Yes, and because when you're living in an alien culture, the day-to-day experience is so peculiar that you just need. Whatever work you end up creating is going to be pretty peculiar. But I studied the craft of comedy fairly deeply, and I realized that for something to work, it has to have some kind of hook that the audience find recognizable. So, for example, with a comedy sketch, most comedy sketches start with something that the target audience can recognize, like a date or a job interview or a dinner party, and then they gradually veer into the absurd. And with these comedy songs, they tend to be very conventional in almost every way, especially the first verse, the first 30 seconds or so. And so you've built up an expectation for the audience, and then you steer them into the wacky.
Yeah. Yeah. Or the... I'm sure you'll forgive me for saying they're slightly uncomfortable.
Absolutely. So at Edinburgh Fringe, so my shows aren't on until the evening. So during the days, I'll have to go out and hand out flyers, and I'll be checking out other people's shows. And I'm very much someone who enjoys my own company and isn't a people person and gets overwhelmed easily. So I think I'll get information overload, if I may say. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to prepare 20 songs, and for each of those 20, I'll just a one-sentence witticism to introduce each one. But when I get on stage, I will only be able to play 10 or so because of time constraints. And when it comes to choosing which 10, I will just have to read the room and lean into whatever the atmosphere is.
Which I think is probably wisest at a Fringe festival, because the rooms can be so different, can't they? They can be so people come with such a varied audience, and people have very different kind of tastes and expectations, and so I think that's, I think reading the room is, it's difficult, but it's necessary.
Because on some nights there may be the entire front row might be elderly couples wearing suits and dressed for the theatre, or it might be a stag weekend or a night. So it's I think it's the old Eisenhower quote that plans are nothing, planning is everything.
Yes.
Because as soon as you're in the heat of battle, your plans go out the window, but it's still of the utmost importance that you have plans.
So what sort of things, for people maybe who've not seen you perform before, what sort of things, subject matter, might you be covering in these songs?
Well, at heart, I am a creative writer, and my biggest passion is literature. And so most of my heroes are the kinds of the names you see in libraries. So I like to, I'm a bit of a megalomaniac, and I like to explore every conceivable subject from every conceivable angle. So I like to take on the big subjects, like whether there is an afterlife, or whether there is life on other planets, or ancestors, and present day issues like masculinity, toxic masculinity, immigration or migration, because if you go back far enough in time, everybody except for the Aboriginal people of Australia is an immigrant or a descendant of immigrants. So, like for example, so this past year, 2025, happens to have been a year where creatively everything just came together, and every song I wrote was a signature piece, and they all just flowed out, and I didn't seem to have to work that hard at them. But the previous year was a really slow year creatively, and I found that I really had to forage for ideas, and I filled notebook after notebook of scribblings and crossings out. So, for example, I really wanted to write a song about ancestors, because it's obviously mind-boggling to think of your parents had to meet, their parents had to meet, their parents had to meet, all the way back through the mists of time. So I wanted to take on that particular subject, but I had no idea how I was what angle I was gonna take, or how I was gonna make it entertaining for the audience. But I got there eventually.
It's interesting, isn't it? How, maybe not quite as dramatically as that, but I think we all have those periods of time where ideas just flow, or then they seem to dry up, or you said you had to forage for them, where you have to sort of put that extra bit of work into finding the ideas. Absolutely.
I think this year, well, I don't really need to write that much new material because I already have so much, but this year it's feeling like a slow one, because I've already written about so many subjects from so many angles. But that's just it's a pendulum. But I never, when it comes to anything creative, I never rush myself or give myself a deadline, because it will be like asking a pregnant woman to hurry up and pop out the baby.
Which, sometimes people do, but it's considered rude. So the show is going to be at Edinburgh, and it's going to be at the GM Fringe as well.
Yes.
Do you know venues yet?
Yes, so at the Greater Manchester Fringe, it will be at Gulliver's in the Northern Quarter on Thursday the 9th and Saturday the 11th of July. And the other day I checked and I found out that that clashes with the World Cup quarterfinals, but hopefully the World Cup quarterfinals I think will be later in the evening than that, so shouldn't be a problem. And in Edinburgh, it's August the 7th till 15th inclusive, and it is at Space UK, the theatre. So,
obviously you might not remember that, but I'm hoping that those will subliminally get lodged in your minds. I'm going to put some music on it, but we're going to remind you to check those dates out in July and August later in the show.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
106.6.
Sounds good to me.
You're listening to North Manchester FM. This is Hannah's Bookshelf, and I am talking today to Kevin McGeary. We've just been talking about Kevin's planned Fringe shows at the GM and Edinburgh Fringe this summer in July and August, where he's going to be performing his show, Our Musical Comedians, a Chinese PSYOP. So do watch out for that on the Fringe programmes. Now, Kevin, I wanted to go back a little bit to something that you touched on briefly, which was that you, obviously, music was a big thing for you. When, you know, as you said, not necessarily something that careers advisors would encourage you to pursue, but was always something that was really important to you. But so too was creative writing. Now, you mentioned that you did an MA in creative writing, but I also know what you didn't mention is that you have had a collection of short stories published, The Naked Wedding. Can we talk about that? Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, very much so. So I completed the MA in my early 20s. So that was, it fell out of existence a few years later, but it was called Creative Writing and Personal Development at Sussex University, which is on the outskirts of Brighton. So very nice part of the world. But I had to abandon prose fiction because, I had to be financially independent and build up a bit of career history and learn some new skills. So prose fiction fell by the wayside. But just as I was turning 30 in February 2014, which was the same time I started a new corporate job in China, which was also a new experience for me, I decided I was going to become published as a short story writer. And I was very naive about what it would take or how difficult it would be, or I didn't even know at the time that earning a living from writing short stories generally ceased to be a thing around the mid-20th century. And it's very difficult to get taken seriously. So the only people who get short story collections published by major publishing houses are people who are already established as writers in some other capacity. But it's an art form I've always thought very highly of. So at uni, I became familiar with Chekhov, Guy de Maupassant, Catherine Mansfield, other giants of the field. At GCSE, we did Frank O'Connor, a short story called The Genius, and then Penelope Lively, other giants of the form. And I think my situation when I started writing this book of short stories was a bit similar to the situation of the Maggie Gyllenhaal character in a film called The Kindergarten Teacher. Have you seen that?
I think I have, yeah.
It's really good. So it's one of my favorite films about the nature of creativity. So for people who don't know, Maggie Gyllenhaal plays a kindergarten teacher who's an aspiring poet, and she really wants to. So she's just a typical middle-class suburban liberal mother, but she really wants to be a poet and write poetry. But she just, you know how it is when you overthink these things and you force them too hard, they tend not to work that well. But one of the kids she teaches, he just jots down his thoughts or sometimes says them out loud, and the Maggie Gyllenhaal character thinks that they're really profound and they amount to poetry, and that he's some kind of a prodigy. So she ends up, she steals his lines and she recites them at poetry nights, and they start to go down really well at poetry open mics until she gets exposed for plagiarizing a 6-year-old, which is a tad embarrassing.
I think I have seen that film now. Once you started describing it, I think.
But I think it's the old Picasso quote that everybody's born an artist. It's just life tends to knock it out of us. So I found the fiction I wrote as a prepubescent kid, I would write stories for fun, like where I would set up the neighbor's dad or certain teachers as being the villain, and they were actually really good. And they would have, without me even knowing what these things were, they would have a decent 3-act structure, and they build up to a good climax. And that they would end, that they wouldn't end with a didactic message, but they would have attitudes and values that were coherent. So in my early 30s, I decided I was going to brush off my prose fiction hat and set about writing fiction, because obviously you become more knowledgeable and well-read as you get older. So in theory, the stuff I wrote should be far better than what I wrote as a kid, but it turned out to be far worse, because I was overthinking it. I was trying to be clever. I was thinking about getting published, and even when I was obviously an absolute light year away from getting published for the first 2 years. So I decided to treat it just like so it took 3.5 years of working on it every weekday to finally get that first acceptance letter. But I treated it like you would treat, say, learning a foreign language or a musical instrument, just putting in the hours every day.
Which is so important. And I think sometimes writing, I guess because of that, I'm not blaming like Casso particularly, but that idea that everyone's born an artist, the idea that art is some sort of inherent thing within us and we just need to get it out. But actually, I think treating creative writing, like you say, like learning a musical instrument or learning a second language, or third, depending on how many you speak, where with those things you would expect to have to practice every day. You would expect to have to learn the mechanics, but then practice the craft every day. So I think it's absolutely right that that's what you did.
Yeah. So because of how much it took out of me and how hard I worked at it, I don't think The Naked Wedding, that book of short stories, is the best thing I've ever done, but it is. Getting those short stories published is my proudest achievement, considering how hard I had to work at it. So when I started, I discovered that two books were published that first year, 2014, when I started writing this short story collection by authors who were close to me in age. So, and one of them was The Incarnations by Susan Barker, who is currently happens to live in Manchester, actually, and teaches creative writing at the university. So, and that novel is set in Beijing. So, and as you know, being a Westerner, publishing a work of fiction about people of color from the global South is a bit tricky, unless your book happens to be a masterpiece, which this one was. So I happened to have, I was assigned to review it within the first 2 months, just by coincidence. And the more I read it, the more I realized if this is the standard you have to reach, then just forget about it. As a Mayford, so the Incarnations is a whodunit that spans 1,500 years. And another thing about contemporary publishing is something to get sold by a major publishing house, something has to fit neatly into a category. So whether it's romantic comedy, horror, crime, literary, but so that it was published as literary fiction, but it's really a thriller. It's far more gripping than most actual thrillers. And the other book I discovered in that first year was Spoiled Brats by Simon Rich.
Oh, that one I don't know.
Simon Rich, as a student, so he was born in 1984, the same year as me. As a student, he was the editor of the Harvard Lampoon, and in his 20s, he was routinely getting published in the New Yorker. So just one of these annoying people. But his comical short stories, I think they were mostly published in the Shouts and Murmurs section. So both of his parents are authors for the New York Times. So his dad was the columnist Frank Rich, and his brother is the novelist Nathaniel Rich. So a very literary family. And Spoiled Brats is they're really wacky, funny short stories, and they wear their technical brilliance very lightly. If it resonates with you. So one of them is narrated by a hamster in a classroom. One of them is narrated by a chimpanzee. The others are narrated by inanimate objects. the magnum opus from this collection is called Sellout, and it's about Simon Rich's great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather is working in Brooklyn in 1912, and he falls into a vat of pickles and gets frozen in time. And so he comes to present-day New York, and he notices, present-day Brooklyn, and he notices that the men still have beards, and the women still look too thin and close to death. So it's a sort of fish-out-of-water comedy, where he...
but quite observational comedy. Yeah.
And the title of the collection is Spoiled Brats. So it's a satire of present-day New Yorkers, particularly Simon Rich himself.
So these books, did they guide your writing, or were they just a sort of almost like a moral support of this can be done?
They were sort of like a rabbit to chase after.
Yeah.
So, because when I was taking the MA at Sussex Uni, it was all very too young. So the creative writing course I took, it's really for people. All of my classmates were either mid-career professionals or retirees, people who were so disgustingly middle class they didn't need to work for a living. But I wasn't in that position at all. But early on in that MA, I read a piece by Al Alvarez, the critic who was personal friends with Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes and a lot of luminaries. And he observed that finding yourself as a writer is a bit like being a teenager, because when we're teenagers, we tend to go through phases of imitating other people's personalities until we find our own. So, for example, you might go through a phase of being a goth and move in those circles, and then you might go through another phase of being a hippie, and then another phase of...
I think you're just describing the phases of my writing, actually. I think...
And that's what I mean. So you imitate other people until you you sink into your own skin and you find your own voice. So sometimes on some days I took a pen and paper and just wrote entire Simon Rich short stories down on a page, word for word, hoping that his effortlessness would rub off on me. And that may or may not have worked. And so some of my early drafts, my stories were all set in China, which itself brought a challenge, because you find that they're written in English, but they're set in China. So you're having to portray a certain walk of life and world, but you're also having to explain it to the readers. So that was a really difficult balance to strike.
I imagine,
So I'd ask people I'd ask Chinese friends to translate an entire draft into Chinese, and then I would translate it back into English, so to get the rhythms of dialogue and thought processes more correct. So I tried a lot of everything, and many of the methods were probably a waste of time, but to know that, you still have to give them a try.
But this is what you were saying. It's like learning a musical instrument, where you may well learn musical techniques that you're never going to play yourself. You're never going to incorporate into music that you're writing yourself. You do sort of need to know how to do them.
So the individual stories included, so The Disposable, which was published by Fabula Argentea eventually, based in the US. And so it's the narrator is an iPhone. And so the iPhone is reincarnated from a Foxconn worker. So in the early 2010s, Apple and Android products are mostly made in China by a company called Foxconn. And I'd been to their factory a few times. So their factories are like mini nation states. They're absolutely massive. But in the early 2010s, there was a wave of suicides by Foxconn workers because their lives were so miserable. So that was quite newsworthy. And there was one Foxconn worker who committed suicide, and his poems were posthumously published. So the character in my short story is loosely based on him. So So I had to take a bit of research into what the dormitories are like and what people get up to and what little free time they have in these factories, and how they, whether they're allowed to, say, listen to music or otherwise daydream during when they're working on the line. So this sort of skeleton of the short story is an iPhone that has been reincarnated from a Foxconn worker, and the owner of this iPhone is called Kevin McGeary, and who is the villain of the story. So very influenced by Simon Rich. And in the end, when the iPhone ends up disposed of, and he thinks he's going to end up in a lake in northern China, which is a real life lake where the world's tech waste goes, and if there is an equivalent of hell on earth, it is this place. The phone thinks he's going to go there, but actually, the phone's reincarnation in the end is to a rainforest where some discarded iPhones are sometimes used in rainforests to help detect poachers. So. One of the earliest critiques of it was it was a bit heavy-handed with its environmental message, but hopefully not. Hopefully the comedy is powerful enough that people.
I was going to say, still enjoyable. Yes. We're going to talk a little bit more about. I'm going to put some more music on now, because I want to ask you about some of the other stories as well in The Naked Wedding. But we're going to just we're going to have another song for now, and then we're going to carry on this conversation. We're talking about The Naked Wedding, a collection of short stories published 2021 by my guest today, Kevin McGeary.
106.6. Sounds good to me.
Hannah's Bookshelf. North Manchester FM.
You are indeed listening to Hannah's Bookshelf here on North Manchester FM, and you're listening to me chatting today to Kevin McGeary, who you will have heard on Hannah's Bookshelf every month or nearly every month for the last 2 years, roughly, on What Are You Reading? And today I get to actually ask Kevin about his own writing instead of other books. Although we did have a little bit of a detour to Simon Rich's short stories there for a second. Kevin, we were talking about The Naked Wedding, the collection of short stories that you had published in 2021. And, you talked a bit about the work that went into, which I think is quite fascinating. I was really struck by what you said about, when you look back at the stories that if you get the chance to look back at stories that you've written when you were a kid, that they're never as bad as you think they're going to be. And I wonder if it's that you mentioned a little bit about overthinking, and it struck me because you said, they had a 3-act structure. But of course, when we were kids, we didn't think it was a 3-act structure, did we? We were just told to give it a beginning, a middle, and an end. So we did.
So, as an adult, to master 3-act structure, you probably need to spend a few £1,000 on a creative writing course.
Yeah.
In fact, as a kid, it's just hardwired into you.
Beginning, middle, end, yeah. But I wanted to, because you were talking a little bit about The Disposables, which is one of the stories in The Naked Wedding, which is an interesting mixture of there was messaging there was comedy, but it also influenced by quite a dark story, quite dark set of circumstances. Tell me a bit about some of the other stories. And is that typical of the stories in The Naked Wedding, or?
I'd say I like to really take on the issues of the day. I like to be profound, but not wear the profundity too heavily, if that makes sense. So, they're all very different. So because the more I started to work on this short story collection, the more I realized I didn't really know anything or have a particular style. So I had to try a bit of everything. So there's one story called The 27 Club, which was published in the UK in Fiction on the Web. And that's about, it's about a singer-songwriter who contemplate suicide when he realizes his career is over before it began. I wonder where I got the inspiration for that. So there's another one called Shuang, which so before I took this corporate job, I was a translator for a website called Danfeng, which was quite a big deal in its day, but it's no longer even alive online. So I would take news stories from the Chinese media and translate them into English for a Western audience. And the stories I publish tend to lean toward the sensational, because well, obviously, in a country of 1 billion people, you're going to have a few colourful characters. So I tried to I wrote down a list of 7 of the most salacious stories I'd ever translated, and I thought, can I squeeze them all into one story, but also somehow make it seem real, make people relate to this character. So there was at the end of 2013, there was a story I translated, and it ended up in media all around the world, especially the Metro in England, about a pregnant woman, so a pregnant mistress who raided a wedding, and got into a fist fight with the actual bride. She raided a wedding wearing a wedding dress, claiming she was the rightful wife of this man who the bride was marrying. So the footage that appeared online was just 2 women wearing wedding dresses having a fight over the same man.
Fair enough. I can see why that got people's attention.
Yeah. And also another story that is piece of news that I translated that is shoehorned into this is a woman who gave birth in the toilet of an internet cafe, because healthcare in China is really bad. So, and it's quite unaffordable to many people. So, often babies aren't actually born in maternity wards because some people can't afford to go there. So that also happens in the same story. And just a few other real. So the hardest thing about this was, of course, what happens is really sensational, but sensation isn't good enough for a short story. People have to relate to your characters. So I really had to dig into the character's backstory. It ends up being, it's narrated in the form of a letter from this woman to the man who jilted her. So it was actually it was the first one to get published in the end.
So you took those stories and made them things that had happened to this character, or things that had sort of informed the character?
Yes, as her backstory. How does what kind of life do you have to live to end up in that situation, and what on earth might happen to you afterwards, and even more importantly, what might happen to the baby that you're pregnant with? So I read a bit about, of course, over the past half century or so, China has become notorious for a female infanticide. But I think it's important not to lose sight of the fact that infanticide is more likely caused by hard lives than hard hearts, because, of course, there's nothing more devastating than losing a baby. So the climactic decision in the end is whether to keep the baby. But so I
can see what you mean about sort of going to the profound.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So I found myself having to completely relearn 3-act structures and how they work. And there's a scene set at an abortion clinic, and of course I've never stepped foot in an abortion clinic, so some of the research I had to some of the methods I needed to use to research these short stories were odd, but it was a great feeling to finally get those acceptance letters.
And was that research? I mean, it sounds like from the little bits that you've said about some of the stories that research is important to you, to not kind of sort of just blunder in and write what you think somebody's life or somebody's circumstances will be.
Well, I think to make your characters real, you have to know everything about them. Most of it won't appear on the page published draft, but from what pets they had as a kid to what brand of toothpaste they use, you need to really know your characters. And I lived in China, but my knowledge of the everyday lives of ordinary Chinese people wasn't that profound. So I had to ask around, and of course, for most of the story, she's pregnant, and of course I don't know what it's like to be pregnant, so I had to research things like that, like how you lose your ability to clip your own toenails, or lie down in certain ways. So, and if you live on your own and you have no friends, then how do you overcome those challenges? So, but the thing, when it comes to any two people, the differences between them, so ethnicity, gender, age, religion, are always superficial compared to the similarities.
I think, and I think that's when, for me, that's when literature can be really powerful. That's when stories really draw me in, is when being encouraged to focus on those similarities. Because I know it's a slightly controversial opinion, but I think readers identify with characters that may be in many ways different to them, but they can still identify with them. They can still follow that story. They can still be rooting for them or think that they're the villain or whatever. And I think that's, I don't want to use the term shared humanity, but you know what I mean. It's those similarities, isn't it?
That's why instances where literature has changed the world, like, for example, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So there was no recording devices in those days, but President Lincoln is alleged to have said to Harriet Beecher Stowe, "So you're the little lady who started this big war." Fiction, I think, even better than journalism or non-fiction, fiction can really help get under the skins of, help us understand people who we are told are very different to us.
Yeah, because I think it's because of that identification. We're not understanding literary characters like a subject to be observed and studied or something. We genuinely feeling their journey. I'm getting very woolly with my language, but we're genuinely feeling and following their journey. We've gone very deep and but also slightly woolly there. I think it's probably time for a little bit more music. I am going to be talking more to Kevin in after 3:00. We're going to be talking more about his work and about some of his other writing projects, and I'm sure we're going to mention his music again. He's also going to be sharing his selections for this week's Apocalypse books when we take our weekly trip to the library at the end of days.
106.6. Sounds good to me.
It's Saturday, the 14th of March, just gone 6 minutes past 3, and you are listening to Hannah's Bookshelf here on North Manchester FM through till 4 p.m. today. And I am talking today to musician, storyteller, essay writer and regular contributor to What Are You Reading on Hannah's Bookshelf, Kevin McGeary. In the first hour of the show, we talked a bit about Kevin's musical comedy, and just a reminder that he will be performing his show, Our Musical Comedians, a Chinese Psyop, as the Kev at both the GM Fringe and the Edinburgh Fringe in July and August. We also talked a bit about Kevin's short story collection, The Naked Wedding. I wanted to ask you a little bit about, you mentioned half jokingly, but I think we all know seriously as well, in the first hour of the show, Kevin, you mentioned those two competing or simultaneous desires, one to be creative and one to function in society, that you've had to those are your goals.
Yeah. So I went to uni so my bachelor's degree was from 2002 till 2005. So this was the era of gross out comedies and lads mags and Alco Pops. So, and as a male, one of my biggest desires in life was to become a published author, although I knew it was a very rare thing to earn a living from. And I found men aged 16 to 29 were only ever encouraged to show three emotions, really. Anger, schadenfreude, and horniness. Whereas I wanted to experience everything that life had to offer. So as an undergrad, I did 2 modules in screenwriting, and I got really mediocre grades in both. And my thesis for my bachelor's degree was a short story collection, and it showed, I'd say, it lacked basic competence, but it had grand ambition. So, and obviously, you need to have. So I think my ability was always going to take a long time to catch up to my ambition. Let's put it that way. And of course, when I finished the masters at Sussex Uni in 2006, it got the highest grade, actually, my thesis, which was a novelette. Because in this particular context, it was exactly what they were looking for, but it wasn't what the publishing industry was looking for. And the tutor described it as a radical and interesting idea, very intelligently carried through. And of course, in your early 20s, when you're entering the job market, employers aren't really looking for radical or interesting ideas. They're looking for people who can prove their worth by showing up on time and crossing T's and dotting I's and making cups of tea. So I found that there were no easy answers to me. So it happened. I'd never even thought about teaching or thought about living in China before then, but teaching English in China helped strike the right balance, because it would help me be fully financially independent. It would put a roof over my head, clothes on my back, but it would also allow me enough time to work on my own projects and still have my own brain.
So can I ask why China?
Just a coincidence. I looked at Bolivia, I looked at Japan, but China appealed to my inner megalomaniac, because the following year was the Beijing Olympics. So China was very much the up-and-coming superpower. Yeah. It's the country of the Great Wall and the Terracotta Warriors and Lao Tzu and Confucius. So there was an ancient language to get your teeth into. And I really enjoyed languages at school. I did French and German, but I never did a language A level, which I should have. So I really wanted to master a foreign language, and Chinese seemed to be the right balance of useful and challenging. Yes, definitely.
Oh, when you learned Mandarin, were you learning that when you were in China?
Yes. So when I first went to China, I didn't speak or read or write any of it. So So I wasn't allowed to speak Chinese on the job because I was teaching English, and there was to be no Chinese in the classroom. But just every evening, so we lived in this, us Westerners on the staff lived in this dormitory. It was a bit similar to the Big Brother house in that it was mixed sex, and everyone was in their 20s, and people were young and hedonistic. But while my colleagues were going out and getting drunk most nights, I would stay home and study the language really hard. And I just studied the language with every spare minute, the speaking, reading, writing. So my first, the first textbooks, so the spoken language, Chinese has a romanized form called pinyin, which I use to type the language. So most beginner level textbooks are entirely in pinyin, and you only start learning the written characters later. So when I finished working through my first textbook, I used a Chinese dictionary to translate the entire textbook, to complete the entire textbook using characters rather than pinyin. So,
wow.
Again, just multi-hours a day.
I like the fact, though, that led to you being better at karaoke as well.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Yeah. Because I wouldn't even dare sing in public until I happened to get into karaoke. And I only got into karaoke because I was in the middle of nowhere and there was no other entertainment.
I think that's such an interesting addition to, that on the one hand there's you translating a textbook and working quite almost forensically through language learning, but then there's you using that to be able to sing songs in Mandarin at karaoke.
Yeah. Well, the world is skewed in favor of outgoing and performative people. So, and you have to. So, as I wrote in a recent Substack essay, that when I was a young adult, one of the most successful pop songs of the era contains the line, "If you can't get a girl but your best friend can, it's time to move your body." So, in other words, to find a life partner to share your soul with, you have to learn to prance around like an Egypt.
Yeah, basically. That's how the world works.
Yeah, all civilizations have their rituals, and that's ours.
Well, I think that's really interesting. I think it's kind of fascinating how you came to learning Mandarin, going to China, which obviously has been a huge influence on yourself, but also your writing as well. Now, am I right that you did an MBA as well? Because a little bit about the masters that you did in creative writing, but you have got an MBA as well.
Yeah, so I started it in 2017. So while I was working, from ages 30 to 34, so the years 2014 to 2018, I was in a corporate job in China for a massive Chinese Fortune 500 company, and I really needed that stability and discipline and structure to be able to create those short stories. So at the same time, I was working on that short story collection, but I also realized I was sort of I thrived in the corporate world in the sense that I would speak only when spoken to and never say boo to a goose, and a lot of employers like that. But I realized I was sort of chuntering along unspectacularly, and when it came to describing my worth to future employers, I would not be sure what to say. So I took an MBA, and so at European University, mostly by distance, but partly I would go there in person to take the exams in Barcelona, their Barcelona campus.
Oh, right, okay.
So because I just wanted to expand my skill set and get out of my comfort zone. I hadn't done any maths since GCSE, which was 20 years earlier, so that was a good way of dusting that off. So for the thesis, you had to choose a particular issue in a particular industry in a particular country, and I chose diversity in the UK publishing industry.
Wow.
Because, so it takes on a bit of everything. So I happen to be experienced with publishing from writing that short story collection, and diversity is even more so now than it was in 2018, was one of the most contentious issues of the day, because it involves a bit of everything. It involves under the umbrella of diversity comes the Black Lives Matter movement, which came into real prominence after the murder of George Floyd, the Me Too movement, which was happening at the time in 2017, LGBT rights, that movement, and various civil wars that are going on within feminism at the present time. So that, like the short story collection, it appealed to my inner megalomaniac. So it was it's sort of inspired by a dispute between Penguin Random House UK, which had recently made an announcement about their diversity drive, and the author and columnist Lionel Shriver, who made some very valid points about the problems with this diversity drive. My conclusion comes down about 60-40 on the side of Penguin Random House. That was finished 7 years ago, so it might be different now. But it's still I think part of literature's job is intellectual discomfort. And if I excel at anything as a musical comedian, it's making people uncomfortable. So it was another way of taking on the biggest issues of the day, unflinchingly, but also with a fine-tooth comb.
Which I think is quite interesting that this was in the context of an MBA rather than a creative writing degree, because it's a different lens through which to look, for those of us working or desiring to work in being creative in various creative pursuits, or the arts generally. I think things like that we look at it through a particular lens, whereas you were looking at it through a different lens, because it was through the lens of publishing as an industry and a particular issue, as you said, in a particular industry, in a particular area, particular region. So it must have given you the opportunity to, like you say, to scrutinise it in a very particular way. Did it change your thoughts around publishing or around literature generally?
Well, I went into it with an open mind. So, what Penguin Random House had described the publishing landscape in the UK as being, and I quote, hideously middle class and white. But really, to become a published author, above all else, you have to be hideously talented and hardworking. So in a sense, being middle class and white is only secondary. And Lionel Shriver hit back saying, "Great writers are found with an open mind." So, and I think if you try to follow this diversity drive to the letter, it can lead to a form of close-mindedness. So, a similar phenomenon would be Ivy League universities in America, when they try to have a certain proportion of a certain minority group, so Asian Americans were disproportionately likely to have high enough grades to get into a Ivy League university. However, they weren't fitting the right percentage of entrance into these universities. So one of the unintended consequences of this diversity drive would be to penalize people for being Asian American, which is the opposite of its original purpose. Yeah. So I think it's like, it is definitely a good idea to get more minority voices, particularly working class voices. But it is a case of the path to hell is paved with good intentions sometimes. So because American culture, so almost every US president has been a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male. However, and most senior roles in American government have mostly been WASP males. However, American culture has generally come from marginalized groups. So, for example, blues music coming out of the African American community, or so much of America's literature and film has come out of the Jewish American community. However, that just sort of happened on its own. It wasn't because of well-meaning white liberals introducing policies. So cultural movements happen organically rather than as a direct result of policy. So I think it is a good idea to encourage more marginalized voices into publishing, but you have to be very careful.
Yeah, and I think perhaps the picture is a little bit more complicated than a simple policy or statement can capture, really.
So the Booker Prize started in, I think, the late 60s or 70s, and when I was researching this throughout the 70s, the people on the long list, there was a really small amount of people of color who were shortlisted for the Booker Prize in the 1970s. But now the proportion is very respectable, and the more you focus on identity politics, the more danger you're in of overcorrecting.
And ignoring what perhaps the real issue is, which is, why do people feel barriers or experience barriers before they get anywhere near the point of being nominated for the Booker Prize? Why might someone not try and pursue the creative arts in the first place? That's my take. Sorry, I'm not going to dominate with my take. I will let I'm going to put some music on before the apocalypse, So we've given you something to think about before we start talking about the end of the world. How about that? You don't normally get that on a Saturday afternoon. Well, you do if you listen to Hannah's Bookshelf, obviously. But it is nearly time for our weekly trip to the library at the end of days. I'm going to put some more music on, and then I'm going to be asking Kev to share his selections for this week's Apocalypse books. So as always at this time on a Saturday, let's have some music, and then let's have the end of the world.
106.6.
Sounds good to me.
Apocalypse Books.
That's right, it is that time of the show when I ask my guests, in the event of the apocalypse, when society has crumbled all around us and we're on the run from probably zombies, I'm not getting too close to find out exactly what they are. We're heading for the coast because that's what you do. Just enough time to grab 3 books and shove them in your bag. No more than that, because then you'd have to start chucking out water and food. Which 3 books are you taking and why? So I've put this question to my guest today, Kevin McGeary. Kevin, you've got room in your bag, 3 books, and that's all. What's the first book that's going in your Apocalypse Go bag?
The first book is a work of fiction that won't need too much introduction. It is The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien.
Yeah, I don't think it really needs a lot of introduction, but I am curious as to why we've got The Lord of the Rings first.
So I found a couple of years ago, I wrote a Substack of my all-time 10 favourite novels, and this was one of the very few that had a happy ending. And I think in the time of the apocalypse, we'll need to read something with a happy ending.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit... There's still work to be done at the end, but at least the ring's gone. I think that's how I've always interpreted that ending.
Yeah, it is. So I'll start out with a standout quote from fairly near the beginning where Frodo says, "I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened." And Gandalf responds, "So do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us." So J.R.R. Tolkien I wouldn't say he won the lottery of history when it came to when he was born, because he was of an age to fight in the Western Front. So he was good academically, and in most respects, he had a fairly stable upbringing, but being a soldier in the trenches of World War I is one of the worst lives available to a human, I think. And after the trenches, he later became a professor of linguistics, and he was an expert in Anglo-Saxon, and he created the languages that are used in Middle-earth, the world of Lord of the Rings. And if anything, the stories he created were a bit of an afterthought: The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion. So I read this book when I was 14, and it's the books that you read when you're a pubescent kid that usually end up being the most important of your life. And this was I wanted to experience everything that life had to offer. And when it came to I've devoured a lot of books over my lifetime, and I've read a lot of thrilling page turners, and I've read a lot of books that were more profound than The Lord of the Rings, and had more three-dimensional characters than Lord of the Rings. But I still think it is my best experience of a book, and it does. I think it captures most of the entirety of human experience, if the human experience doesn't include women talking to each other.
Yeah, it doesn't include a lot of that.
Because I think the films, which come to a total of about 10 hours, I think that they almost fail the Bechdel test, except for one very brief scene.
Yeah.
But
the books certainly do. But I'm really interested in, because the Lord of the Rings has been, anyone who heard the anniversary show for the 10th anniversary of Hannah's Bookshelf last year, will remember that Lord of the Rings is the book that has been saved the most on Apocalypse Books. But I feel like you just captured something in how you described it. That you described it as the best experience, or one of the best experiences of reading, and I feel like that's really kind of, you've put your finger on there as to why the Lord of the Rings means so much to so many people. Is not because of the story or the characters necessarily, but the experience of reading it.
So, and this was the late 90s when I read it, so I didn't have access to the internet, and I didn't know anyone else who had ever read the book. So,
oh really?
Yeah. So it was only later that I discovered how big and how popular it was. So have you ever seen a film from the 1940s called The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp?
I have, yes.
Yeah, made by the great filmmakers Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, and the protagonist is. So he starts his military career in the 19th century, and so when World War I breaks, the first decade and a bit of the 20th century was a time of generally growing prosperity, and there were no major wars between powers, and a lot of people thought that this situation would never end. And then, of course, in 1914, Armageddon happened, and no, I don't think anybody, even a military strategist or a general who'd been training their entire life for it, could have envisioned what war would look like, because tanks were a completely new invention, machine guns were a relatively new invention, chemical warfare was new, and so people saw war in a more noble light than they did afterwards. And of course, I think European civilization lost a lot of confidence afterwards. But I think that the values of the Lord of the Rings are generally quite solid. A sense of duty, a sense of right and wrong, the protection of the Shire, protection of the strong protecting the vulnerable. So I like that about it.
Yeah, and I think it again, you've sort of caught something for those of us who read it, not when it was first published and not in that wave of popularity it had in the 70s. But after that, so I read it, as I've mentioned on the show, probably every time someone saves it. My dad read it to us when we were kids, and then I read it as soon as he could persuade me to read it myself, you know. And I thought it just existed as a book my dad, the book my dad read to us. It was much, much later when I realised that other people had read it too. The same as with you, that you didn't know anyone else who'd read it. And I think that's why it matters so much to a lot of us, is because we had this really personal experience with it. And for all the problems with it, because there are some problems with it, I guess we all identify with Frodo, and we would all like to think that we would do what Frodo did. We would all like to believe that we would make that choice. Nobody reads it and thinks, yeah, I'd probably be like Boromir. We just think I would be Frodo. Although I'm rereading it slowly at the moment, and I think actually I've always just assumed I'd be Merry. Always identified with Merry. Make of that what you will. What book are we following up The Lord of the Rings with, Kevin?
Okay, so from a very long book to a very short book of under 100 words, A Short History Myth by Karen Armstrong. So Karen Armstrong is not that well known, but she has published a lot of books. So when she was young, she was a nun, a Catholic nun. So she was a nun in the early 1960s, living in a convent when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. So the sisters were told that there was a nuclear standoff between the world's two great powers, but they were never told that it ended. So they went on for months thinking that the world was about to end. So later Karen Armstrong left the Catholic faith entirely, but she's written many books about religion. So her first book I read was A History of God, which she's a woman after my own heart, because obviously to write a book like that you have to be a bit of a megalomaniac. And she's also written biographies of Muhammad and other religious figures. So she's in the 2000s when it was at its most important, she really built a bridge of understanding between the West and Islam. And her shortest book is this one, which I read in 2006, just after it was published, A Short History of Myth. So, and the whole thing, which you can read in one sitting. And I'll read one brief paragraph from it. We are meaning-seeking creatures. A myth, therefore, is true because it is effective, not because it gives us factual information. If, however, it does not give us new insight into the deeper meaning of life, it has failed. We need myths that will help us to identify with our fellow beings, not simply with those who belong to our ethnic, national, or ideological tribe. We need myths that help us to realize the importance of compassion, which is not always regarded as sufficiently productive or efficient in our pragmatic, rational world. And she goes on to cite novelists as the myth makers who can help us negotiate the problems of our lost and damaged world. Because am I right in thinking that she's very clear on the myth and storytelling, that these are the same thing, really, and are a key facet of being human, I guess, of humanity and human thinking. Yeah. So she, I don't think since she was young and was a practicing nun, she no longer is really a believer, but she's a really eloquent thinker on the subject of God. And so she doesn't necessarily share the consolations of organized religion, but she recognizes their importance and how and why they're so difficult to satisfyingly replace. Well, those are, I can see, two sort of connected books in a way, because we're thinking about the importance of storytelling and myth. But as you say, lengthwise, very, very different. I'm curious to know what you're going to complete the triptych with. What is the third book that you're saving? The third book is a poetry anthology, if that's okay. Mm-hmm, yeah. Probably shared this one before. Staying Alive by Neil Astley, which was published in the early 2000s. So it's an anthology of English language poetry, although there's quite a few translations into English. And so the categories of the chapters include Body and Soul, Roads and Journeys, Dead or Alive, Growing Up, Man and Beast, In and Out of Love, War and Peace. So, like I said, because literature is one of the very few fields in which megalomania is a good thing. So it takes on the really big issues, but also in a really bite-sized kind of way. And you will find poems by the dead white men of the canon, but you will also learn so many, discover the work of so many lesser-known poets, and it's just I always go back to it, and I'm always surprised, and I always every time you read it, it's a new experience. Just like people say when you read Anna Karenina, but before you've experienced falling in love versus after, it's a completely different book and completely different experience. And so I keep this book on my shelf, and when I'm teaching ESL to a very advanced student, English as a second language, if the student is strong enough, I bring this book along, because there's always something new, and there's always some wisdom to consult. And so subsequent to this, it's published by Blood Axe Books by Neil Astley, and it's the first in a series. So there's Staying Alive, Being Alive, Being Human, and they're all great. But I've chosen the first in the series, Staying Alive.
Well, it's just I can actually see my copy of it as we're talking. It's such a full, rich collection, and as you say, it's divided into these categories, which are huge subjects. You know, these massive concepts that kind of affect us. But the poems then surprise you in the way, you know, that so the section on War and Peace, for example, it's not a collection of war poetry. It's not as straightforward as that. It's fascinating perspectives. And so, as you say, there's always something that you can go back to, always something that'll surprise you. It is a really rich collection, I think. So that's a fabulous selection. So that is Staying Alive by Neil Astley, joining A Short History of Myth by Karen Armstrong, and The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. These are Kevin McGeary's selections for this week's Apocalypse Books. If you'd like to see the full range of books that have been saved by all of my guests on the
7 days a week. 106.6. Sounds good to me.
You're listening to Hannah's Bookshelf.
You are indeed listening to Hannah's Bookshelf here on North Manchester FM. We are back from the apocalypse, our brief Saturday sojourn to the end of the world, with my guest today, Kevin McGeary, who's just shared his selections for Apocalypse Books. Kevin, there was something that I did want to ask you about, because you mentioned it really briefly, and I sort of vaguely mentioned it in my introduction to you, but we've not really talked about it, which is that you write essays or articles of kind of different topics on a Substack that you have. Can you tell me a little bit about the sort of subjects that you enjoy writing about on there?
The Substack is called Creative Unconscious, but the URL is just kevingeary.substack.com. And the premise comes from so one of the contenders for my Apocalypse book, the non-fiction section, was Soil and Soul by Alistair McIntosh. So Alistair McIntosh is not a household name, but he's a Scottish academic who spent most of his life on one of the islands off the north of Scotland, so a very hardy seafaring people. And he once observed that the modern day problematique is like a ball of strings, and so for example, one of the strings is politics, another is economics, another is philosophy, another is science, another is ecology, and to pull at one string is to partly unravel the ball. So you can't learn about one of them without learning something about the others as well. So it's about sort of trying to it's a way of organizing my thoughts, but also going on the long journey toward polymathy. So I write about a bit of everything. So recent, and one of my New Year's resolutions was to make it a weekly thing rather than a monthly or sporadic thing. So recent titles include John Carey and Me, so about the late literary critic John Carey, who I had a slight connection to, and his amazing writing career. Other ones I posted recently include Work is the New Religion, which is a bit of a memoir about my selling door-to-door in the US during one of my university summers. Another is 5 Tasteless Jokes for the Ages. Another is Poems that will make you glad you understand English. And there are a lot of upcoming ones which I've already written and scheduled. These include the 5 ever greatest pieces of classical guitar music, 4 friends from my past who I've fallen out of contact with. So it's mostly non-fiction. I've shared a few short stories on there over the years, but it's mostly non-fiction, and it's a way of just bringing it all together. because one of my heroes is the author Clive James. So Clive James was fairly well known as a television presenter, but like most humans, what he did for a living was not the most interesting or impressive thing about him. And he was actually a polymath. He was a published poet, published novelist, a critic, and a linguist and translator who, over the course of his adult life, became literate in a ridiculous range of foreign languages. So it's just a way of finding a home and an outlet for all of the peculiar bits of knowledge I've acquired over the course of my very weird life.
And I think it's good to have that sort of platform where you can delve deep if you want, or not if you don't want, but into those different strings that make up the ball, threads that make up the ball, as you described. Well, because when it comes to my main creative activity in recent years has been the musical comedy, but I think as someone could sit down and listen to every single one of my songs and not really know what my actual politics are or religious beliefs are, because they touch on all those issues, but they're really evasive when it comes to actually taking a position. So the Substack is about organizing my thoughts and letting the world know what I really think about certain things. But also having that variety as well, because I think nobody wants to be... well, I don't know, maybe some people do, but nobody wants to be tied to only being able to write about one particular subject or one particular thing, and just having to trot out different takes on the same thing over and over again. And so this gives you that opportunity to talk about variety. I mean, weekly is ambitious, but I'm guessing that you're not worried about running out of things to talk about since you have the whole world.
I could very well run out of time, but running out of subjects will not happen. Over the past 15 years or so, the internet has been really gentrified, and people you don't really blow up. You don't really go from being a nobody to a somebody online without a strategy these days. Whereas in the 2000s, people like Bo Burnham came out of nowhere to blow up on YouTube, and now he's a massive Hollywood celebrity. And I don't think that really happens anymore. But I think to build your online following, you have to really stick to one subject, which is unfortunate for me because I'm interested in everything, not just one thing.
Yeah, but I guess it's all about what you're looking for, isn't it? If you're looking for sheer volume of followers and money, then I think you have to have that particular USP, don't you? You have to have that particular but if you're looking to explore things and maybe make connections with readers who also want to explore those things, then going around the different subjects is definitely possible. Do you enjoy that form of writing? Because obviously it's a very particular form of writing as well. It's that personal essays.
If I had a choice, if a genie offered me the chance, and if I could have a world-leading talent for any one thing, it would be prose fiction. But you have to play, and this is all mostly non-fiction. But I find I seem to be better at non-fiction, and you have to play the hand that you're dealt. And even if I were a highly accomplished novelist, it's not as if it would make me rich or famous. So I don't lament the life that I don't have. I'm quite happy with the way things are.
And there is, there's creativity in that personal essay format as well. It's not. I think people think, that you just sort of spew out some words onto the page or something.
Well, some blogs are just stream of consciousness, but to build up a following on Substack, you have to really work at it.
Mm. So when did the Substack start?
2022.
Right.
And initially, it was just I was just going to write a mini series of of essays on subjects that interested me. So big ideas like, well, the first one was on the subject of fame. The second one was on the subject of smiling. Then I wrote one on the subject of education, another one on the subject of comedy. And it just sort of grew from there. So, and I ended up posting, at the end of every month, I would post an update about what had gone on, what had been going on in my life that past month. And so that's been, it's coming up to 4 years now.
Yeah. So there's quite a lot on there. So if you wanted to check it out, you've got plenty of subjects to read about. There's a link. If you go to hannahkate.net and click on the post for today's show, there's a link to Kevin's website and also to his Substack too. Normally at this point on the show, I would be saying, like, what's next and that, but I'm guessing that the Fringe, preparing for those Fringe performances is really kind of the big focus for this half of the year. You mentioned that you were putting together, because obviously you've got a huge amount of material that you can draw on. So are you just at the point now of choosing that playlist?
The only dilemma is what to leave out.
Yeah. So, and will there be information about the dates? Because you did mention the dates and the venues are already set. Are they on your website or on your Substack?
Yeah, the ticket links are already online, so people can just look up Our Musical Comedians, a Chinese PSYOP, and it's all there.
Excellent. We are running out of time a bit, though, Kevin. Thank you so much for coming and talking to me today, and for talking about the upcoming projects, but also I've really enjoyed sort of just talking about publishing and about writing with you.
Thanks.
And I'm sure we'll hear from you again on What Are You Reading very soon. But that is the bugle starting to play, so it is time for me to say goodbye to today's guest, Kevin McGeary, and say Hannah's Bookshelf will be back next Saturday at 2 p.m. when it will be the Spring Equinox special. You've got 2 days left to submit your short stories for your bite-sized seasonal flash fiction. If you can tell a spring-themed story in just 3 minutes, you've got till midnight on Monday to submit that for next Saturday's show. Massive thanks once again to my guest Kevin McGeary. Today, do check out the links for Our Musical Comedians, a Chinese PSYOP, coming soon to the GM Fringe and the Edinburgh Fringe. Stay tuned now, though, because Joe is coming up with his dance and club show. He's got all sorts of tunes lined up to play you into your Saturday night. This is all coming up for you, only on North Manchester FM 106.6.